sort of makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? That if you shut people in their houses, the nasty disease cannot leave the home, and so no one will get infected in the disease.
Yeah, but they don't realize Professor Sanatra Gupta from Oxford was correct. She was saying back in March, April, this is all over the place. And the thing is, we know now the first UK known man to die was in December he died. This was in Europe in November. They have it in the sewage in Spain in November. It's a high circulation virus. We've all been told that endlessly. And from November up until March, it was allowed to travel with no real controls whatsoever. So the thing is, it got all over the place.
So it was there before we could do anything about it. By the time we even thought about doing something, it was way too late.
Essentially, sorry, the screen went blank there. But yeah, essentially, and if you read Hope Simpson, the British doctor who studied influenza for 50 years, and he wrote a book, The Transmission of Influenza, there's lots of data he puts together about a dormancy and endemic nature, that the virus comes, it can fill out, and then it can trigger seasonally. So these people who have a perception that, oh, you're hiding yourself away, it's not going to spread, it was all over the place by March, but no one was really testing. Yeah, and then the seasonal trigger occurred.
So it was lurking all over the place, just waiting to get people.
Well, I'd say, yeah. In Brazil, it has been proven in Brazil, it was in the sewage water in community circulation November 2019, same as Europe. But while Europe triggered seasonally, the virome triggered in kind of March, back down again. In Brazil, we got the big hump out in May, June, July. But they all had the virus in the sewage back in November. So, the virome is very complex and pervasive. And these simplistic human ideas that will just lock people down. Cuomo in New York came out with astonishment after they did a lockdown in New York, and they found out weeks later that 66% of the new cases were people who were locked down at home. And they couldn't understand it. But lockdowns don't really work unless you lock down a country when there's hardly any virus and you get in so early and lock down a big geographic area like maybe an island and you truly keep it out. But once it's in and circulating for months, the lockdowns just can't keep up with it. You just get the natural curves.
What are the countries that have emerged as shining examples of how to deal with this problem? I mean, Sweden, obviously, and Sweden has taken so much stick. And maybe you can help me out on this one. Whenever I cite Sweden to a true believer in the coronavirus monster, they always say, "Ah, yes, but the neighbouring Nordic countries had a lower death rate," and there seems to be a certain series of set excuses to explain why, even though Sweden looks good on paper, in fact, in reality, it is just disastrous.
Well, that's back again, exactly, James, to propaganda, because that's not science, it's propaganda. So I'll throw out a couple of things. One is that the Nordics and Sweden, when they took their actions, you could say Nordics locked down, Sweden obviously didn't. Completely different approach. At that stage, whatever you did would affect the death rate around 3.5 weeks later. Because obviously, if you stop infections now, the deaths you've stopped will begin to show up 3.5 weeks later because of latency. But the reality was, Sweden was rising up in death rate way before that 3 weeks passed. So Sweden was already destined, right, to have a much higher rate than the others, independent of the lockdown measures. So that's just a reality. The other thing is that there's now a paper published, 16 reasons why Sweden has a higher death rate than the Nordics. That's the actual title. It's published. And the first one they put up is mine. My favorite one is prior flu season severity. So it looks like that one of the biggest determinants of a country's actual impact on mortality is how severe the prior flu seasons were. So Sweden had a much lower mortality of elderly than you would normally expect. And then they got a high peak of mortality. And it's very sad, but the reality is there are people who would have been taken in a prior year and they're still here, which is great. But when a tough virus like corona, that's like a bad flu equivalent, comes along, they're rapidly going to obviously be in the firing line. So it's sad, but that's reality. And we see across 17 or 18 countries nearly always the same pattern. If the mortality in the past year and a half, 2 years is kind of normal, they get a low hump for corona. And if they've got kind of a trough in their mortality, lower than you would expect, below, significantly below, then they get a peak. And that's just one of the 16. The 16th is lockdown. And this team said, to be honest, with all the other, immigrant populations, density, with all the other factors, lockdown doesn't really have anything left to offer. And that's why there's multiple papers showing that.
Yes, you call it the dry tinder effect, don't you? All those.
I'm avoiding the word because would you believe it's a word I took from someone else's published paper? It wasn't mine, but a lot of people get offended by it. So I'm sure you're not worried about that.
Not my audience. My audience like it good and hard, and no, they do.
Oh,
They like steel dildos, probably Steely Dan.
some iron in the glove.
Yeah, exactly. They do. At least unless I've grossly misunderstood my audience. Yes, and tell me about Brazil versus Peru.
Yeah, so there's endless examples of this, but I give Brazil Peru because Brazil, the president, very publicly said no lockdown. Now, some boroughs did their own lockdown because they were panicking, but that was the country's strategy, and he was attacked like Sweden, seriously attacked, obviously. And Peru then did military-style lockdown, and I think they had the mandatory masks as well from way back. But the two of them, Peru has the worst deaths per million, and they both peaked and are humping seasonally out in May, June, July, even though they had the virus in November, same as Europe. So I'm just going to make that point again, that the virome, it just doesn't respect lockdowns.
Are we eventually going to realize that Brazil and a few others, Belarus, did the right thing? Or do you think they'll always try and arrange it? They being, I don't know, the people in charge. They're always going to arrange it so we don't know the truth.
Yeah, I'd say the latter, unfortunately, James. I mean, it's just too big a mess up to ever allow to be perceived as what it was. No way. So Sweden is a real problem because Belarus, you can say, oh, they're lying about their death figures. I have people there. They're not. They did not get that overloaded. It's to do with population health, really, and they're just lucky and prior seasons. I'm not sure the politics of Brazil, but again, this thing can't be admitted afterwards. And I think this is a terrible thing, but we've locked down and we've had masks all summer, which was crazy because we should have been allowing safe spread and more immunity to build up when there's no real impact in the summer in Europe. And now they've probably caused more impact to happen in the winter. So that's tragic. But the other thing is they're doubling down on lockdowns now coming into the winter. And I think part of it is an instinctive fear that if we don't lock down now and do measures and the winter goes ahead and is kind of normal, everyone's going to say, but hold on a minute, then seasonality is true, herd immunity is true, all the stuff that the other people were saying, it looks like it's all true. So they almost have to keep up the pretense now with all this pantomime that we're seeing in the UK and Ireland. It's crazy, but yeah.
It's a massive face-saving exercise by the political class.
Part of it, and part of it is, there are lots of organizations in the world that really, this is a huge opportunity, shall we say, and they're very influential. So there's a lot of vectors pushing it, but one of them is that instinctive, realization. We'd better do a lot of fanfare. So if the winter turns out okay, we'll have done that and we can credit that. And the old one is the fable of, the tiger horn that keeps away the tigers. And after a year or so of blowing the horn every night, a boy says, but there aren't any tigers. And of course they say, yeah, see how effective the horn is? It's a new religion and everyone has adopted it. If you were just allowed to wear them, out of the good of your heart, or you believe in them, that's fine. But we got fines and they've become law in the middle of the summer. And that's another thing. In the middle of a rising epidemic, with your ICUs filling up and your hospitals potentially overloading, like back in March, precautionary principle, you could say, well, let's throw everything at it. Masks, some lockdowns, we'll do everything just in case. But why do we do it in the middle of July or even June? Why were masks all suddenly coming in as the godsend in the middle of the summer when Europe had already clearly finished with the epidemic and there wasn't going to be anything happening till next winter? Why would you wear masks then? So even on that single point, even if they had some function, why the hell would you bring them in the middle of a summer when nothing's happening? Because if you bring in something like that when nothing's happening, if you start blowing your tiger horn, when are you going to stop blowing it? So that when are you going to stop? I mean, when that came out, that was one of the worst days I had, because I had told my wife, who's also a first class honours engineering, so she obviously has all this data and gets it. I told her in April, I said, look, the curves are turning. We knew that Italy turned before the lockdown really came into effect, if you look at the data. And we know China as well. Professor Levitt did all the analysis. So this curve's going to turn down independent of their lockdown, and then they're going to have to drop it all and claim it worked. But what happened? In May, they weren't really dropping the measures. And in June, they weren't dropping the measures. And I was pulling my hair out, hair I don't have. And I said, they're actually just going to keep going with this, even though it's gone. And I thought, where's this going to end if that's what they're going to do? And then in July, they started talking about mandatory masks. And I just went, oh, Jesus. We are in the twilight zone now. Because they no longer need any science or any logic. They literally don't need anything anymore. They're just doing stuff.
Can you just give me any grounds for hope at all that this lunacy is going to end? Can you see any way it will?
Yeah, well, in terms of predicting, people are saying, oh, second wave. I think the best guess from the science is we'll go into the winter and we'll see a reasonably normal excess mortality winter in Europe. That's what the science would say. You can never say never. Maybe something weird will happen. Maybe it'll be a soft winter because many susceptible have passed in the corona spike in March, April. But let's say it's a normal winter. I think as time goes on and increasing pressure against the lockdowns, which we're seeing especially in the Telegraph and in other newspapers and in Ireland now in the Irish Times, we're seeing a lot of pushback and a lot more awareness of case-demic and a lot more awareness of immunity from all the publications that have come out. I think there'll be more pushback and their position will become more and more strident looking. And if they don't really get anything but a normal winter, increasingly their position will look precarious. So I'm hoping that the people will rise. A tipping point. Once you get 10% of people to realize something and they're vocal, you can often tip the herd over. And I think we may get near 10% in the next few weeks, hopefully, of the population. And I hope they're vocal. The biggest killer, James, and the most shameful thing of all, the media has been shameful. Doctors and specialists all over the world know a lot of what we're saying. And they can't really speak up because they'll get in trouble. And I think that is just an awful shame. There's 400 doctors in, I think, Belgium the other day came out with a letter to the government saying everything we said. There's 650 in Germany. There's, I think, 700 in some other country. Canada have a big bunch as well, who are coming out publicly in groups. We need doctors and specialists in medicine to be standing up and calling this thing. We just do.